As we lead over to the land acknowledgement, it is important to acknowledge why we do this, even in a virtual space. A land acknowledgement is more than a formality. It's a vital practice that reminds us of the deep, enduring connection between Indigenous people and the lands we inhabit. Today, as we gather from various corners of the world to envision and build a sustainable, inclusive future, we must recognize and honor the original stewards of these lands. By acknowledging their past, present, and future contributions, we not only pay our respects, but also commit ourselves to fostering relationships based on understanding and mutual respect. Furthermore, envisioning a sustainable and inclusive future means actively righting the wrongs of the past. This includes acknowledging the injustices faced by Indigenous communities and working towards meaningful reconciliation. It's about understanding that our journey towards a better future is intertwined with the history and experiences of those who came before us. By committing to this recognition, we take a crucial step in creating a truly equitable and sustainable world. It is my pleasure to introduce our land acknowledgement speaker, Jackson Pind. Jackson Pind is a Settler-Anishinaabe historian of Indigenous education who focuses on the history of Indian day schools in Ontario. He's currently an assistant professor of Indigenous Methodologies at the Chanie Wenjack School of Indigenous Studies at Trent University. He was also an editor on the spirit of the Grassroots People, seeking justice for the Indigenous survivors of Canada's colonial education system. Please take it away, Jackson.
Thank you. I'll just get started and share my screen. I prepared some slides. I know everyone's kind of around Turtle Island this morning, so I'm going to try to introduce you to the land which I'm on and the land that I really occupy here and my ancestors have since time immemorial. So I really don't accept too many of these land acknowledgements anymore. I think sometimes they're not as powerful as other speakers, but I think I'll try to do my best. I saw the conference and a lot of my research aligns with the work that you folks are doing, including on climate change, especially on this territory here. And you also have a very cool logo, so I copied your logo as well. But I like to start these off by speaking our traditional language of Anishinaabe Mo'in. This is a language that is unfortunately at risk right now. There's only about 3,000 speakers left on Turtle Island, and it really as a result of the residential and Indian day school system. So I like to say Ani Bojo, Jackson Indigenous, Maingin Indo-Deidum, Nagojoanon Indonjaba, Sindam Zaga Ingon Inda, Michisagi Anishinaabe Nini. So what I said there was, my name is Jackson. I was born and raised in Nagojoanon, or Peterborough, where Trent University is located. And that actually means the place at the end of the rapids. And I'm currently calling from Sindam Lake, which is just north of Kingston, about 2 hours north, if you know where Kingston is, or about an hour and a half west of Ottawa. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Sindam here in a second and who that person was. And I also said I'm a mixed ancestry. So my family is from Alderville First Nation, which was one of the communities I will talk about here in a second, and as well as a couple other European nations like Denmark and Finland. So I'm really honored to kind of open up your conference, hopefully in a good way. As a historian, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the past and also how we're coming into the future, and give you some understandings of the land that we were really lucky to occupy here, just on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. So we'll begin. I'll get things underway. And really where I'm calling from this morning is what's now known as a lot of ecologists have called the land between. And you can see this is Lake Ontario down here, and this huge kind of bioregion that has now been deemed the land between. And why it's called that is because it is a bioregion between the St. Lawrence lowlands and the Canadian Shield. And what we're coming to understand, or what Indigenous people have understood this whole time, is that this land actually is one of the most biodiverse regions in the entire country, and frankly in all of Turtle Island or North America. And this can rival basically any other place around the world. A lot of people don't think that. They think it's just kind of farmers' fields and a lot of kind of small cities and cottage country, to be honest. But really for the Anishinaabe, we have called this area the backbone of Mother Earth. And that has been something that we've cherished for a very long time in this region. And in particularly, I would say our prophecies. We have a number of prophecies from way back in ancient times, and this was a place that we were called to. One of the ones that is most prominent for my community of Alderville, which is just kind of south here in Peterborough along the Rice Lake waterway, is actually this prophecy that said we'll basically travel from the east coast of Turtle Island until we find an area where food grows on water, and that is wild rice, or monomen, as what we like to call it, which is a good seed. And that's really one of our main food sources, I would say, our most essential ones. And unfortunately, it has been decimated as a result of climate change and people pulling out wild rice because it doesn't actually fit a lot with cottage culture. But I'm really going to focus on this area today and kind of this whole stretch because I'm calling kind of over down here, but it really Trent's kind of closer to Peterborough. So this whole stretch of land is Anishinaabe still to this day. And I'll give you a little bit of a background, really fast forward version, I would say, of some of the main points I'd like to draw out today. So one of them, and if you're in this area of Ontario, I always like to encourage people, especially in the summer, to go on a road trip around some of our ancient sites that are still there today and still protected by the Anishinaabe people. So I like to start in kind of the eastern area over here in Bon Echo Provincial Park. And in Bon Echo is actually one of the largest collections of pictographs in the entire country. And it's actually built on one of the deepest lakes in Ontario. You actually have to take a canoe and kind of paddle across this big lake. It's called Mazenau Lake and Mazenau Rock. And you can see all the pictographs still there to this day. And that was an important gathering spot that we used to go to and still go to this day to have ceremonies. And it's kind of the eastern direction, I would say, of this whole kind of area around Peterborough or Nagojo-on-Nong. The other side is really exciting as well. If you're in the area, it's Peterborough Petroglyphs Provincial Park, and that's actually the largest collection of petroglyphs, which are kind of carved rock inscriptions by the Anishinaabe anywhere in North America, but particularly in Canada. It's our largest collection. They have over 900 different inscriptions on just one rock face. And that rock face, unfortunately, now there's a building over it, and there's lots of conversations about maybe taking that building down because it really disconnects us from the local natural environment of that site. And what we talk about in that site is that each one of those 900 pictographs or petroglyphs are actually a library or a story in itself. And so you can think about that as kind of our knowledge center. And what we call that site is Kinawajamakong, or the teaching rock. So it's really important for education. We bring a lot of students up there and teach about our histories. One of the other sites, more in the western direction, we call it, is Majikaning fishing weirs. And a lot of new historical research is coming out about this one. And you can see it's kind of on the mouth there of Lake Simcoe. And really basically what happened was Indigenous people made these massive fishing weirs to basically only fish for 1 week a year. And then the rest of the year, they had enough food to supply themselves. And what we found out, the new kind of archaeological evidence, is that this site is actually 5,000 years old, or older than the pyramids. And we have been continually going to this site for a very, very long time, and we continue to protect that site moving forward. And then finally, kind of wrapping out the circle, and you can notice that if you went on this road trip, or really a canoe trip back in the day, it really encircles Peterborough or Nagojoang, and really shows why it's so important, this area of our lands. We believe actually Peterborough is where we used to send our people right before they passed on in the spirit world, because you had everything you needed in that site. And the last and most significant site, I would say, and many people don't know about this, is the Serpent Mounds. And the Serpent Mounds is similar to the Ohio Serpent Mounds, if you're familiar with that giant serpent-like figure. But this one was found on the north shore of Rice Lake, kind of right outside of my community of Alderville First Nation. And this site has been dated to 2,000 years old, or as old as Christianity in the West. And it was a burial mound. There's been lots of new evidence kind of coming out recently that shows, just recently on June 21st, on the summer solstice, that the sun actually aligns perfectly with the mouth of the serpent. And it was a form of our calendar back in the day. So all of these sites kind of circle Peterborough or Nagojo-on-Nong, and it really shows how sacred this area is to our people, which I find really beautiful. And if you're in the area, again, I'd really encourage you to go to as many sites as you can. Most of them are open to the public, except the Serpent Mounds, because unfortunately, all the burials were removed by the Royal Ontario Museum, and we're still fighting to get our ancestors back. So I'm going to go, I kind of start off with some more of our happier stories about our land, but I need to also, I think, talk about the colonialism that happened as well when we acknowledged the land, and some of the drastic changes that happened really beginning in the 1800s. So This is a picture of a person that's not a good guy. It's actually the name of my lake is named after him, our Syndham Lake. His real name was Charles Poulett Thompson, and he was really the first, I like to call him, Prime Minister of Canada. But at that time, it was just the United Province of Canada. He was the first Governor General. And the French also don't like him very much. They call him Le Poulet, or Little Chicken, basically. And Indigenous people also had a lot of run-ins with this man. And here in Canada, we've had a lot of reckoning with a lot of more famous, I would say, colonial figures like Sir John A. Macdonald or Egerton Ryerson, for example. They changed the name of that university. But some other people that are also doing some terrible things kind of have slipped under the radar. So I just like to tell a little bit about his story and how quickly the land changed under his reign. So before he became the first Governor General of Canada, this is what Canada looked like at that time in 1838. And again, this is pre-Canada, technically. We didn't become a nation until 1867. But you can see how the land had already been colonized, especially on this north shore of Lake Ontario and right into the land between. So our people kind of recognized that settlers were coming. They welcomed them in many ways in open arms and really tried to heal them back to health. And we recognized that they were fleeing a lot of oppression as well from Europe. And we were promised this whole section of Indian land, if you can see it here, basically stretching from these imaginary lines all the way to the western shores of Turtle Island. And you can see that's kind of where the original settlement happened here in Ontario. Until this day, this is still a very heavily settled area, which I'll talk about here in a second. So that's what Canada looked like before he took power. And you can see how quickly here in a second things started changing. So Syndham also wrote a lot of things, like a lot of colonial governors at that time. And I was able to find this letter, which I think really shows his unfortunate perspective towards Indigenous people. And this was written in 1841, so excuse the language, of course. This is written at a much different time, but I think it's important for me just to say what he said about our people. So he said, quote, circumscribed, the Indian loses all the good qualities of his wild state and acquires nothing but the bias of civilization. He does not become a good settler. He does not become an agriculturalist or a mechanic. He does become a drunkard and a debaucher, and his females and families follow the same course. He occupies valuable land unprofitably to himself and injurious to the country, and he gives infinite trouble to the government and adds nothing either to the wealth, the industry, or the defense of the province. And if you know anything about very early pre-colonial history, that is pretty common language, I would say, towards Indigenous people. And all of that was obviously a lie and a heavy misrepresentation of Indigenous people's value to this land and also to even the colonial governments at the time. Before this, we had actually just helped the British beat off the Americans in the War of 1812, but that obviously was forgotten a few decades later. And unfortunately, if you look just a few decades after his control in Ontario, you can see that whole stretch of Indian territory was completely taken without really any treaty process, which was supposed to happen here on Turtle Island. And you can see basically we have been, in many ways, evacuated from this entire territory. You can see there's no land that is now belonging to First Nations, despite the fact that we were the original owners of this land. And in fact, you can't even see the reserves that we were forced onto just outside of Peterborough here. There are 3 small reserves of Hiawatha First Nation, Curve Lake First Nation, and Alderville First Nation, where my family was sent. And you can see, unfortunately, that they're completely vanished from this map. And that was a very quick process that happened. And through that process, a lot of things changed with the land as well. There is somewhat, I don't know if it's a good news story, but a few months later, actually, just after writing this letter, Syndham died a really horrific death. He actually fell off his horse in downtown Kingston, and that then died 2 weeks later as a result of gout, or as they called it in the day, rich men's disease, or the disease of kings. And unfortunately, in some ways, he passed away, but his legacy has still been a big part of how Ontario was constructed. And if you look up, if you're in Ontario, if you look up your town and it was created around that time, you'll definitely find a street name named after him. There's one in Toronto, there's one in Ottawa, there's one in Kingston. The lake I'm on this morning is named after him. And a lot of people have not come to reconcile that history yet. And I really want to change the name of this lake. I think it's not really becoming of someone such as Syndham. But as I said, his policies really changed the face of this country and really broke down the relationship between the government and Indigenous people. So I like to show this map as well and to show an overlay of agricultural production in 2018 and the treaties. And you can see really why settlers kind of flooded into this area and started taking land through a treaty process that was not really, I won't go into the whole treaty history, but it was really not fair and done in an accurate way. And you can see how quickly this happened. So basically, all of these treaties were somewhat forced. The one I like to talk about somewhat as well in these types of land acknowledgement is one signed just outside of Kingston here, known as the Johnson-Butler Purchase or the Gunshot Purchase. And that one literally was you could take as much land as you could hear a gunshot from Lake Ontario. So obviously, those boundaries are up for heavy interpretation of where the lines were. And you can see how quickly settlers came into these areas and took over. And if we now compare that to the agricultural production in Southern Ontario, you basically can see this is where our breadbasket is. All of our most productive food is grown here in Southern Ontario, and especially down towards the Niagara Falls region. We have a bunch of really fancy wineries down there, peach and apple farms, and basically provided the sustenance for the rest of the expansion across Turtle Island. And if you look closely at this map, kind of the red shows where agricultural production is really heavy. The green is still the land between, which is kind of our saving grace. They found it was very difficult to actually farm traditionally in these regions, and is why some of these ancient sites were left untouched for a long amount of time. And I think that's important just to kind of overlay the historical side and the modern kind of contemporary side about how the land is currently being used. And I like to show this map as well about Canada and show the population density of our country today. And you can still see that really stretch of land here that was so valuable to the early settlers and also to our people as the Anishinaabe. Is still where the majority of Canadians still live today, especially in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. And basically, most of Canadians live around that stretch or right along the stretch here of where the border will become with the United States. And that, again, is a historical legacy, a colonial legacy of where people have settled and have continued to build up massive metropolises that are still impacting Indigenous communities today. And I think this map really does a good job of showing that without kind of the colonial boundaries that were put over top of the map moving forward. So how they talk about this history, it is kind of difficult as well, just to recognize how much has changed. If you drive through kind of Southern Ontario, a lot of people don't even see any Indigenous presence whatsoever as a result of this massive influx of settlers and really farming and agriculture that came through this region. And which is so important now, and what we're recognizing today is that Indigenous people are still comprising less than 5% of the world's population, but protect over 80% of the global biodiversity. And if you think again of that land between area, Indigenous people have been on the front lines of many different movements there. There have been kind of uranium protests, Minoan protests, kind of logging operation protests, all throughout the last 150 years. And we're continuing to protect these sites moving forward. And I think that's some of the encouraging news, is that people are finally recognizing that Indigenous people need to be part of these conversations and have a lot of knowledge about what areas are our most important right now to protect, and including the land between. So as I kind of come into the end here of the land acknowledgement, I'd like to kind of provide some hope as well about things that are going on in our territory and hopefully inspire you if you're able to kind of get involved as well as some of these efforts. So one of them is this website called The Land Between, which is kind of a collection of both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people who are working together to kind of petition the government and try to fight for a lot of these at-risk species. Currently, in the land between, 59 species are at risk, and they've done a bunch of cool things, such as a new mapping program to kind of map where these sites are, as well as trying to organize petitions, volunteer organizations right now, trying to protect a whole host of turtles. It's kind of turtle season right now in Ontario, and a bunch of them unfortunately get hit by cars. And there's now kind of a massive network of turtle protectors that go out and make sure snapping turtles and other really at-risk turtles make it into their kind of nesting areas, as well as a big push to try to naturalize your property. And I'm really proud here. I live on a lake and I haven't touched anything along the lake shore. As we know, really the Anishinaabe lived within 50 meters of the lake shore. And that's basically where all our mishkaki or medicines are. And I think that's a huge thing people can do if you live on a lake or know anyone that lives on a lake, not just to cut grass and put kind of a monoculture in, but to make sure you have kind of a wetland type area that looks exactly like that photo on the right. So I encourage you, if you're kind of inspired and learn more about the land between, to check out this website. And if you live there, to really kind of do your best to do your part. I think that's important. And as well, I think another big organization here in Peterborough or Nagoja is a friendship center. And I like to end these land acknowledgements just by saying, that if you're able, and maybe if you learned something this morning, to please consider maybe donating to the Friendship Center. They do a bunch of work for urban communities, especially in Peterborough, and a lot of that work is actually trying to protect a lot of the urban areas from too much development or too much kind of just putting concrete everywhere. There's a big kind of fight, unfortunately, right now in Peterborough, if any folks are here from there, about a big pickleball court that they're trying to pave over a park right now. And I know the Friendship Center has been on the front lines of trying to kind of stop that development. So I appreciate the time you shared with me this morning, and Miigwech, and have a great rest of your conference. Miigwech.